As we speak, a remarkable thing is happening in the United Kingdom. Former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is having to field some tough and rather uncomfortable questions over his failures during the pandemic. In other words, Johnson is having to face the music as the British people are getting access to pages and pages of private emails, WhatsApp group chats, and conversations that took place around the COVID leadership table during the pandemic.
Can I just say how glad I am to be at this inquiry, and how sorry I am for the pain and the loss and the suffering
sit down.
Of
please stop.
COVID
Stop
victims.
Please sit down.
It's remarkable not just because it's a rare display of politicians being held to account for their failures, although that in and of itself would be quite remarkable. It's remarkable because it appears as though the United Kingdom is the only place in the Western world currently trying to get to the bottom of what actually happened. I mean, only 230,000 people died and millions of lives were ruined due to their unscientific and authoritarian mandates. What's the big deal, right? Now in Canada, no such formal inquiry is obviously taking place, but a group of patriotic and courageous citizens took it upon themselves to launch the National Citizens Inquiry to figure out what happened in our country during that remarkable time. The findings of their inquiry, which were wrapped up a few weeks ago, are truly astounding. The federal government and provincial governments across the country lied to us in order to justify absurd restrictions on our freedoms. We were misled about the unscientific and forced use of masks. We were misled about the forced compliance with social distancing rules. And of course, we were sold those safe and effective vaccines, which were so safe and effective that we had to be forced and mandated to take them. Not to mention that COVID brought with it one of the worst collective failures in journalism history, which I think is pretty safe to say at this point. So where are the calls for formal accountability in Canada? Why aren't politicians and unelected bureaucrats forced to face the Canadian people? Tens of thousands of Canadian lives were lost, and millions of lives were irrecoverably ruined by the restrictions and mandates on our freedoms. So what is everybody afraid of? Drop a like in the video, help us out by subscribing to the True North YouTube channel, stick around for the Ratio of the Week prize, and the comment question for the episode is this: why aren't elected politicians calling for formal accountability? Let me know in the comments, and let's get into it. A country in which political leaders and unelected bureaucrats can ruin and upend the lives of millions of their own people due to their own mistakes and face zero accountability is not a free country. It's not a democratic country, but it's the country that we live in. It is what's happening in Canada. It's the kind of thing that should scare every Canadian, and most importantly, it's the kind of thing that every Canadian should be paying attention to. Now, the great people over at the National Citizens Inquiry have been paying attention to this. After 24 days of hearings and listening to over 300 testimonies, along with sinking thousands of volunteer hours into research, the National Citizens Inquiry have published their final report. Now, the findings of the National Citizens Inquiry final report won't surprise many Canadians. But what also won't surprise many Canadians is the complete lack of interest taken by public health officials and political leaders into the recommendations and findings of the inquiry's final report. That's because not only do these people not expect to be held to account, but they have no interest in holding themselves to account, obviously. So what will actually come from this monumental citizen-led effort? As a matter of fact, the National Citizens Inquiry sent out 63 summons to public health officials and political leaders to see if maybe they would like to show the Canadian public what they were up to during that time and if they have any justification for what they did. Of course, not a single official testified at the NCI, not one.
The haughty attitude of absent officials who refused invitations to testify leaves many wondering what these nabobs of national health and their political overlords have to hide. The record of their refusal to speak with their fellow Canadians stands, and truth and trust are the losers.
That is the equivalent of giving a giant middle finger to the suffering Canadian public. The Canadian public whose lives were ruined due to their mistakes, their failures, and yet they have no interest in showing up to the citizens-led inquiry. But before we get into more of this, let's go over some of the major findings of the NCI report. The first and most important finding of the NCI final report is the need for Canada to launch a full judicial investigation into the authorization of vaccines in Canada, along with exploring criminal liability under existing Canadian law. something that I think millions of Canadians would like to see happen. Other findings include calls for a thorough review of the Canadian courts' handling of pandemic-related cases to rebuild public confidence in the justice system, examining and reforming the extent of executive authority during emergencies and establishing clear frameworks for public health authorities' decision-making processes, balancing public health needs with individual rights and freedoms. The report also emphasizes safeguarding healthcare professionals' freedom of expression and conducting an independent inquiry into the governance of professional colleges, especially those governing medical professionals. The NCI also insists on maintaining in-person learning as the primary mode of education, with remote learning as a contingency, and calls for a review of labor laws to protect employees during health emergencies. The report also highlights the importance of supporting vulnerable populations during crises, the necessity of informed consent in medical treatments, and the development of a judicial panel to investigate human rights violations during the pandemic. The NCI also proposed the establishment of a National Crisis Oversight Council to monitor and investigate government actions during crises, and calls for a national dialogue on the Church's role in society, emphasizing the need for policy watch to protect the rights and freedoms of faith groups. So again, I ask the question, why aren't opposition political parties demanding that provincial governments and the federal government hold themselves to account? What could there possibly be to lose for the Conservative Party, for example, to demand that the federal government launch a formal inquiry into the pandemic? What could there possibly be to lose for the Ontario NDP to demand that Doug Ford's Progressive Conservative Party be held to account for their mistakes? Right now, nobody, whether they are in government or in opposition, are trying to get to the bottom of what happened. But that's not what is happening in other parts of the world. Boris Johnson has been hauled before the official public inquiry into the pandemic in the UK. The British people are getting access to these crucial private documents, which give them front row access into what was actually going on. Whether or not any accountability will actually be delivered is one thing, but at least the appearance of accountability is something. Imagine if we got access into Theresa Tam's private communications when she decided to flip-flop on masks, or when she peddled those safe and effective vaccines. Imagine if we got to see conversations between Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland. Or what if we got to see Jason Kenney's private communications, or Francois Legault's private communications, or Doug Ford's private communications? Those people work for us, and they should be reminded of that every single day. In Ireland, a country that is currently trying to pass dystopian and authoritarian online hate speech laws, has also committed to holding a formal pandemic inquiry.
But it is important that we find out what we got right and what we got wrong, and that's why there will be a public inquiry, and a public inquiry will be established this year to examine how the pandemic was handled in Ireland, not just the healthcare aspects of it, such as what happened in hospitals and nursing homes, but also testing, the public health advice that was given around mass antigen tests, all those things that became controversial, and also the economic response. All these things need to be inquired into.
But of course, this isn't happening in Canada. Now, the only province that can be given any credit whatsoever in any of this is Alberta, which also happens to be the province which became known in this country for arresting pastors on a regular, routine basis. The Alberta government launched the Public Health Emergencies Governance Review Panel, which was led by former Reform Party leader Preston Manning. The review panel's recommendations focused mainly on instituting significant legislative amendments in order to protect civil liberties, which is hilariously evident to anyone in this country paying attention. So again, not much is going to come from this review panel. Did this review panel hold Jason Kenney to account? Did it hold Dina Hinshaw to account? Of course it didn't. The only people who really seem interested in trying to get down to business and to hold these people account are the people at the National Citizens Inquiry. The longer time goes on, the more Canadians are going to forget about what happened to us and what our leaders did to us. The government deputized private security guards to go house to house to check your papers if you happen to be in government-enforced quarantine. Those vaccines were sold to us under a marketing slogan, safe and effective. Canadians were told by the state where they were allowed to go inside of their own country. The Canadian Armed Forces were militarized against the people as they conducted propaganda testing on unwitting civilians. Students weren't allowed to go to school if they didn't take a vaccine. You couldn't go to a gym. You couldn't go to a movie theater. You couldn't go to a restaurant. Long-term care homes basically turned into death camps. And the government-backed and government-funded media not only peddled propaganda, but shamed Canadians who dared to defy restrictions. Hats off to the great people over at the National Citizens Inquiry. Their tireless efforts deserve our full and complete admiration as Canadians. As far as I'm concerned, the commissioners of the NCI deserve to be inducted into the Order of Canada for their efforts. The most disgusting part about this, however, is that all the awards, all the accolades, and all the decorations are going to go to the public health officials who ruined the lives of millions of Canadians and who have escaped accountability. All right, time for a quick ratio of the week. The winner this week is one of Justin Trudeau's most loyal cabinet ministers, Seamus O'Regan. While delivering a speech at the Empire Club of Canada on Monday, Seamus wanted to remind Canadians that we're still not over COVID. Well, Canadians disagreed with Seamus here. 3.1 thousand replies to only 678 likes. Most of us are much more concerned about the government's response to COVID than COVID itself. Canadians would be in a much better place if government had done absolutely nothing at all but left doctors to treat the disease in the healthcare settings. Get out of here with your propaganda. You're all pathetic. I feel like someone wrote a script on how to lose the next election and you are following it to the letter. Well put. All right, everyone, that's going to do it for us this week on the show. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Harrison Faulkner, and this is Ratioed.